In 1968, Dodge built 80 cars, just 80. They shipped the bare bodies to a shop in Michigan, told the workers to strip out everything that wasn't essential for going fast, hammered the engine bay with sledgehammers to make room for an engine that was never supposed to fit, and sent the finished machines directly to drag racers with a single instruction: win. No radio, no heater, no carpet, no warranty. The windows didn't even roll down with a crank, they were held up by seatbelt straps because the crank mechanism weighed too much. And this car, this stripped, violent, barely street-legal machine that Dodge itself said it did not want driven on public roads, ran the quarter-mile in the 10-second range straight from the factory, right out of the dealership, before the driver had tuned a single thing. Today, this car cannot legally run at a sanctioned NHRA event without major modifications that would fundamentally change what it is, the safety rules that govern modern drag. Racing have made the 1968 Dodge Hemi Dart exactly as it was built, exactly as it left the Hurst Performance Facility in Madison Heights, Michigan, effectively illegal for competition in its original form. Not because it cheats, not because the engine is banned, but because it is so extreme, so stripped, so fundamentally raw, that the modern rulebook cannot accommodate what it is without requiring it to become something else entirely. This is the story of the most dangerous factory-built car in American history, and the reason why Dodge's most brilliant idea was also its most reckless one. To understand what the 1968 Hemi Dart was, you need to understand what the superstock class demanded of the manufacturers who competed in it. Superstock in the 1960s was the prestige category of NHRA drag racing, not funny cars, not top fuel, superstock. Because superstock was supposed to represent the pinnacle of what a factory-built automobile could do. These were production cars, cars that a real person could walk into a real dealership and actually purchase. The premise was simple and powerful. Take the best performance car a manufacturer could build, prepare it within the rules, and find out which factory's best was fastest. For the manufacturers, this translated directly into sales. Win in superstock on Sunday, sell performance packages on Monday. Ford, General Motors, and Chrysler were spending serious money on their superstock programs because every win in that class was free advertising to the exact young men they were trying to reach. The horsepower wars of the 1960s were fought as much in the NHRA tower as they were in the engineering offices. By 1967, Chrysler's superstock program had hit a rough patch. Ford had arrived with the Shelby Mustangs. Chevrolet had the Yenko Camaro. The competition was stiff and getting stiffer. Chrysler needed something dramatic, not just competitive, but definitively dominant. The kind of car that didn't just win races but ended conversations. The solution they arrived at was equal parts brilliant and borderline insane. The 426 Hemi Chrysler's legendary big block V8 with the hemispherical combustion chambers that had been dominating drag racing since 1964 was already available in mid-size Dodge and Plymouth models. It was a massive engine in every sense, heavy, powerful, and designed for cars with engine bays large enough to accommodate it without surgery. The Dodge Dart was a compact car, an A-body, a small, lightweight platform designed for economy and practicality, the kind of car people bought when they wanted reliable transportation at a reasonable price. The standard Dart in 1968 topped out at 235 horsepower in its most powerful street configuration. Someone at Chrysler looked at the Hemi, then looked at the Dart, and had an idea so extreme that Chrysler Corporation had a standing internal rule specifically prohibiting Dodge from putting a Hemi in a compact. The official reason was liability, structural concerns. The unofficial reason was probably that someone with good judgment understood that this combination was genuinely dangerous. But the prohibition said Dodge couldn't do it. It said nothing about a third party. So Dodge entered into a partnership with Hurst Performance, the respected performance modification shop in Madison Heights, Michigan, to do what Dodge itself officially couldn't. The result was the 1968 Dodge Hemi Dart, internally coded LO23. Announced on February 20, 1968, available only through select Dodge dealerships, sold only to vetted drag racers who knew what they were getting, delivered with a non-warranty disclaimer that made it perfectly clear Dodge was not responsible for whatever happened next. But here is the part that nobody told you. When these cars were handed to professional drivers like Dick Landy and Gene Snow, the first thing those drivers discovered was that the factory's stated performance numbers were almost embarrassingly conservative. superlative. Dodge said it could do the quarter mile in 11 seconds. And then Dick Landy got behind the wheel and blasted a 10.46 at 131 miles per hour in October 1968 on a car that had barely been tuned. What was hiding inside this machine was something that the factory had either underestimated or was deliberately not telling you. Let's talk about what the Hemi Dart actually was, because the details of how it was built are as important as the performance numbers it produced. Bare Dart bodies were shipped to the Hurst facility in Michigan, arriving without engines, without transmissions, without exhausts, without shifters, without drive shafts. The interiors were empty, no seats, no brackets, no tracks, no window regulators, no consoles, no carpeting, no radios, no heaters, no sound deadening, no armrests. Just a body shell and a floor. At Hurst, the transformation began. To fit the 426 Hemi into a Dart engine bay, an engine bay that was never designed to hold anything close to. That size, the crew at Hurst had to physically modify the shock towers. The method they used has become one of the most famous details in the entire history of factory drag racing. They used sledgehammers. Actual sledgehammers, swung by actual men, beating the metal of the engine bay into a shape large enough to accommodate the elephant engine. The rear wheel wells received the same treatment, hammered out to accommodate the oversized drag tires that this car would need. The engine itself was not the same street Hemi that regular customers could order in a Dodge Charger. This was the full race 426 fitted with 12.5 to 1 compression pistons, a cross-rim intake manifold with dual 735 cubic foot per minute 4-barrel Holley carburetors, hooker headers, and side-exiting glass pack exhaust that was loud enough to rattle the teeth of anyone standing within 20 feet. The official horsepower rating on the paperwork said 425. The actual output, by most credible estimates, exceeded 500 horsepower comfortably, and in a car that weighed approximately 3,020 pounds, when fully prepared, some sources say closer to 3,000. That power-to-weight ratio was simply extraordinary. To cut every possible ounce, Hurst stripped the car with surgical precision. The steel hood and front fenders were replaced with fiberglass units. The doors were acid-dipped, a process that thins the metal by exposing it to chemical solutions to reduce their weight to a fraction of what standard steel doors weighed. The windows in those acid-dipped doors were not glass in the conventional sense. They were made from Chemcur, a polymer-based material lighter than glass, held in position by seatbelt straps attached to the inside of the door panel. You didn't crank the window up or down, you pulled on a strap, because the window crank mechanism weighed too much and served no purpose on a drag strip. The front bumper was thinned down. The battery was relocated to the trunk for weight distribution. The standard Dart front seats were removed and replaced with non-adjustable buckets taken from a Dodge A100 van, simpler, lighter, bolted directly to the floor with aluminum brackets rather than the heavier standard mounting hardware. The hood was held in place, not by standard hinges, but by 4 hood pins, and it featured a massive dustpan scoop that fed fresh air directly to the Holley carburetors. When all of this was done, the car was delivered to the buyer unpainted. The fiberglass front panels were black. The body was bare metal primer, no paint, because paint weighs something, and this car was not built to look beautiful. It was built to be fast, and it was From the moment these cars reached professional drag racers, they were immediately running in the low 10-second range. Dick Landy, one of the most respected and technically sophisticated drag racers of his era, got behind the wheel and within a very short time was recording elapsed times and trap speeds that put the Hemi Dart in a category essentially by itself in the superstock class. The cars were campaigned by some of the greatest names in the sport. Dick Landy himself, who actually received 2 LO23 Darts, 1 automatic for his teammate Bob Lambeck to drive, and 1 4-speed for himself. Gene Snow, who ran one in his own operation, Bob Lambeck, Butch Leal, and Shirley Shahan, known throughout the sport as the Dragon Lady who drove an LO23 at the 1968 U.S. Nationals and gave interviews trackside about her love for the class, making her one of the most visible and beloved figures in a sport that was still largely a male domain. One Herg Mock-Handless, who became known throughout the sport as Mr. 4-Speed, purchased his Hemi Dart in May of 1968 through a Chrysler-backed arrangement with the Memphis Dodge dealer Chuck Hutton. He paid below list price in exchange for promoting Dodge on the track. Within months of receiving the car, Mock-Handless had left his day job and was racing full-time. By October of 1968, he had won enough in prize money to pay off the car entirely. He raced in Kansas City, Wichita, and Denver. He said he never had a bad day in that car. In the AHRA, the American Hot Rod Association, which ran alongside NHRA with somewhat different rules, the Hemi Dart was even more dominant. The AHRA allowed more flexibility in rules, and the Dart simply ran over everything in its path in super stock eliminations. The Hemi Dart program was so successful, and the LO23 cars so dominant in their class, that NHRA eventually had to respond not by banning the car outright, but by creating an entirely new classification specifically to contain it. They called it Super Stock American Hemi, or SS/AH, a class created for exactly these cars so that they weren't simply ending the competition in every category they entered. That class still exists today. It is still active. Collectors and racers still campaign these cars at events, and the class draws crowds of enthusiasts who want to see the originals still doing what they were built to do. The SS/AH class is one of the most emotionally resonant categories in all of nostalgia drag racing because the cars in it are not replicas or tributes. They are the original machines, or at least the closest thing to them that still exist and still run. But here is the problem. What happens when a car built in 1968 to run in the 10-second range, built with an acid-dipped unibody shell, windows held by seatbelt straps, no roll cage, no modern safety equipment, in a structure that was pounded into shape with sledgehammers, tries to meet the safety requirements that NHRA has developed over the decades since? What the rules say today and what the original Hemi Dart was built to be are two things that cannot fully coexist. And that gap between the most extreme factory car ever built and the safety standards that modern racing demands is the most complicated and important story in drag racing that almost nobody talks about. Honestly, the 1968 Hemi Dart was built on a unibody chassis. This is the fundamental fact that defines everything about the car's relationship with modern safety standards. A unibody structure means there is no separate frame. The body of the car and the structural chassis are the same thing. The floor, the firewall, the pillars, the rockers, all of these are load-bearing structural elements that work together to give the car its rigidity. When you acid dip the doors to make them thinner, when you replace the steel hood and fenders with fiberglass, when you hammer the shock towers to make room for a bigger engine, you are modifying the structural integrity of a unibody car in ways that were accepted in 1968 and would raise serious concerns today. Modern NHRA safety regulations require that any car running in the 9-second range, and the Hemi Dart, properly set up and tuned, is very capable of reaching the 9s, must have NHRA chassis certification. The car must meet specific roll cage requirements. The driver must carry a valid NHRA competition license. The chassis must be inspected and certified as structurally capable of handling the forces involved in repeated high-speed passes. Any vehicle running quicker than 9.99 seconds in the quarter mile requires a full NHRA competition license, and the chassis must have a current NHRA chassis certification. Any car running 7.49 or quicker must meet additional advanced licensing requirements. Drivers running 9.99 or quicker must wear certified racing suits. Helmets meeting specific safety ratings are mandatory at different elapsed time thresholds. These rules exist because people have died on drag strips, because the forces involved in a 10-second pass at over 130 miles per hour are extraordinary, and when something goes wrong at that speed in a car that is not structurally prepared for the incident, the consequences are catastrophic. Every safety rule in modern NHRA's rulebook was written in response to something. That happened. The helmet requirements came from head injuries. The roll cage mandates came from cars that rolled and crushed their drivers. The chassis certification requirements came from cars whose structures failed at high speed. These are not bureaucratic inconveniences. They are written in the experience of the people who got hurt. The original 1968 Hemi Dart has a stock unibody floor and firewall, modified in ways that were legal in 1968. It has no factory cage. It was delivered with a lap belt and nothing else in the way of driver restraint. The windows that the driver looks out of are held in place by seatbelt straps. The engine bay was shaped with sledgehammers, and this car in its original, unmodified, factory-as-delivered configuration can run elapsed times that put it squarely in the range where modern NHRA rules require equipment and certifications that the 1968 car simply does not have and cannot easily be made to have without fundamentally altering its original character. If you add a proper roll cage to an LO23 Hemi Dart to meet modern safety requirements for its performance envelope, you are welding structural steel into a car whose entire identity is defined by the ruthless elimination of every unnecessary pound. The roll cage adds weight. The weight changes the performance. The car that comes out the other side of that modification is a safer machine. But it is no longer quite the car that Dick Landy drove to a 10.46 at 131 miles per hour in October of 1968. And that is the tragedy at the heart of this story. There is no villain here. The safety rules that create this problem are not wrong. The NHRA is not being unreasonable. People were getting hurt, and the rules were written to stop that. The fact that those rules now make it essentially impossible to run the original Hemi Dart in its factory configuration at a sanctioned event that is not cruelty or institutional politics, that is the unavoidable consequence of 50 years of hard-won. Safety knowledge being applied to a car that was built in an era before that knowledge existed. In 1968, when these cars left the Hurst facility in Michigan, the NHRA's safety requirements for superstock competition were fundamentally different from what they are today. Roll cage requirements were minimal. Chassis certification for a superstock car was not the exhaustive technical process it has become. The standards of the era reflected what was known and what was required. And what was known and required in 1968 was dramatically less stringent than what we know and require today. Dick Landy believed one of his own LO23 cars had been destroyed in a fire. The racing life of these cars was brutal, and like most race cars, they lived hard, passing from racer to racer until they hit one too many walls or were modified past the point of restoration. Of the 80 original Hemi Darts built, survival rates are difficult to confirm exactly, and documentation of many of the car's histories is incomplete or disputed. What we do know is that the ones that survive in anything close to original, documented condition are treated like sacred objects. One sold at Barrett-Jackson's Scottsdale auction in 2006 for $330,000. The same car sold again at Meckham's Kissimmee event in 2016 for $330,000 a second time. Another correct and documented example sold at Meckham Kissimmee in 2022 for $302,500. These are not cars being bought by people who intend to run them hard at the drag strip. These are historical artifacts, investments, pieces of American automotive history that most owners are more interested in preserving than in racing. But here is the honest tension in all of this. The car was built to race. That was its entire purpose. Everything about it, the fiberglass panels, the acid-dipped doors, the stripped interior, the seatbelt strap windows, the sledgehammer engine bay, every single compromise that made the Hemi Dart what it is was made in the service of going fast on a drag strip. A Hemi Dart, sitting behind glass in a climate-controlled collection, never turning a wheel, is a beautiful and historically important object. But it is also a car that never gets to do the only thing it was made to do. And this is where the emotional weight of the story really settles. Dodge itself never wanted these cars on public roads. The paperwork that came with each LO23 included language making clear that this was a purpose-built race vehicle and that Dodge preferred it not be used on the street. The factory retail price was listed at $5,146, but many were sold for less through dealerships to vetted racers, as in the case of Richard Shipley, who purchased his from Chicago's Grand Spalding Dodge for $4,600 in June of 1968. 1968, the factory wanted these cars at drag strips, in race classes, winning championships. That was the entire point of building them. Today, to run one at a sanctioned NHRA event in the performance envelope it was built for, you need equipment and certifications that require modifying the very thing that makes the car what it is. The safety rules that modern racing demands and the original character of the 1968 Hemi Dart are not fully compatible. The car exists in a kind of permanent tension too historically important to modify, too extreme in its original configuration to run under modern rules without doing so. The SS/AH class in nostalgia drag racing exists precisely to honor these cars in the environment they were built for. But even nostalgia events operate under safety requirements that have evolved significantly from what existed in 1968. The gap between what the original car is and what modern safety demands continues to widen with each revision of the rulebook. Herb McCandless, the man who paid off his Hemi Dart entirely from race winnings in a single season, the man who said he never had a bad day in that car, is part of a generation of drivers who raced these machines in an era when the safety net was far thinner than it is today. They were brave men and women. Shirley Shahan, racing at the 1968 U.S. Nationals, giving interviews about her passion for the class, sitting in van seats held to the floor with aluminum brackets, looking out Kemker windows held by seatbelt straps, competing at speeds that demanded better protection than they had. The modern safety rules exist because of people who raced before those rules did. The 1968 Dodge Hemi Dart is the most extreme factory-built drag racing machine that Chrysler or arguably any American manufacturer ever produced. Dodge itself later acknowledged the LO-23 as the most extreme factory-built drag racing machine in the company's history. That is not a casual claim. That is an official recognition from the manufacturer that what they built in 1968 was something they have never matched since and likely never will. Since 1968, every factory-built race car from any American manufacturer has been measured against the Hemi Dart and the companion, Plymouth Hemi Barracuda BO-29. The standard those cars set has never been surpassed in the category of purpose-built, factory-produced, street-legal drag racing vehicles. They arrived at dealerships unpainted. They ran in the tens on factory parts. They dominated their class so completely that NHRA had to create a new category just to hold them, and they produced a generation of racing legends Dick Landy, Gene Snow, Herb McCandless, Shirley Shahan, Ronnie Sox, who drove them with a combination of skill and courage that deserves a great deal more recognition than it typically receives. The modern safety rules that make the original car's competition form technically problematic are not something to resent or argue against. They represent the accumulated knowledge of 60 years of drag racing, written in the hard experiences of the people who pushed the limits of what was safe before anyone fully understood where those limits were. Roll cages and chassis certifications and competition. Licenses and fire suits exist because of what happened to drivers who raced without them. That knowledge has value. That safety infrastructure has saved lives. It should be respected. But here is what I want you to take from this story. The 1968 Dodge Hemi Dart is the clearest example in American automotive history of a manufacturer committing completely and without reservation to a single purpose. Not comfort, not practicality, not long-term reliability, not public relations or brand safety or liability concerns, just speed. The absolute uncompromised pursuit of going as fast as possible down a quarter mile of asphalt. Everything about this car is an answer to the question, what is the fastest thing we can build and still call a production automobile? The answer involved sledgehammers and acid baths and seatbelt straps for windows and van seats bolted to the floor and fiberglass panels where steel used to be, and an engine that belonged in a car twice its size detonating under a hood. Held down by 4 pins instead of hinges. 80 cars, 1 year, never repeated, never exceeded in the original mission. Today those cars sell for $300,000 when they come to auction. The ones that survive in documented correct condition are among the most carefully researched and obsessively preserved objects in American motorsport history. Collectors have spent decades tracing their lineage, verifying their authenticity, confirming their documentation. Buddy Martin inspected one to confirm its identity. Ronnie Sox signed a letter of authenticity for another before he died. These are not just collector cars. They are primary historical documents. The safety rules say this car cannot race in its original form under modern regulations. The market says this car is worth $300,000. Historians say this car represents the absolute peak of what the factory drag racing era produced, and the car itself sitting wherever it sits, in whatever condition. Its inn doesn't care about any of those opinions. It was built to go fast. It went fast. It went faster than anyone expected, fast enough to force the sanctioning body to create a new class to contain it. Fast enough to make some of the best drivers of its era say they never had a bad day in it, fast enough to still command a crowd at a nostalgia event 50-plus years after the last one rolled out of the Hurst facility in Michigan. That is what Dodge built in 1968 when they ignored their own internal rules, partnered with a performance shop in Michigan, and decided to put the biggest engine in the American arsenal into the smallest car they made, $4,500, 80 units, 1 year. The most dangerous and the most magnificent factory drag car ever built. Now, if you've been with me through the whole story today, you understand something that even a lot of serious Mopar fans don't fully appreciate. The Hemi Dart wasn't just fast, it was the final statement in a specific era, the era when American manufacturers competed directly against each other on drag strips using cars that real people could actually purchase. After 1968, that kind of factory commitment to pure drag racing never came back at this level. The muscle car era ended, the liability concerns got serious, the emissions regulations arrived, and what Dodge did with those 80 cars in 1968 became a historical artifact rather than the opening chapter of an ongoing tradition. There is a companion car to the Hemi Dart that almost nobody outside the hardcore Mopar world knows about. The Plymouth Hemi Barracuda BO29 was built on the same timeline, in the same program, at the same Hurst facility, by the same team. Same engine, same mission, different body, and the story of how these two cars came to exist, the internal Chrysler politics. The corporate prohibition that Dodge worked around through Hurst, the letter that Chrysler's race group sent to NHRA on December 7, 1967, asking permission to build these cars. That story has details in it that I have not told you yet, and they are worth knowing. That story is coming. If you want to be there for it, subscribe. And if today's story gave you something, if it reminded you why these cars matter and why this history is worth preserving, hit the like button. It helps other people who care about this find their way here. These cars deserve to be remembered accurately. The people who drove them deserve to have their courage acknowledged. That is what we do here. I will see you on the next one.